Hey guys, it's Bella. How are you? Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having a great start to your week. If you're new here, welcome. On this channel on Mondays, we talk about true crime cases. So if that's something that you're into, then come join us. Make sure to subscribe. Today, we're going to be talking about a solved case, and I actually haven't seen a lot of coverage of this case. I hadn't even heard of it myself until I started researching it, so thought we'd break it down together. Today, we're going to be talking about the case of Matthew Misener. So Matthew Gerald Misener was born on the 20th of August in 1984 to parents Raymond and Jean. He had 5 siblings and was raised in Tucson, Arizona. And growing up, he was described as a shy kid, a reserved introvert, but those that were close to him remember him as a kind and caring person who you could always rely on. Eventually, he took up an interest in wrestling, which really helped him to come out of his shell. And when he graduated from high school, he went to Pima Community College, not so much for an education, but more so because he wanted to wrestle. In 2011, when he was 26 years old, he met a 25-year-old woman named Georgina Mendoza, and this was your classic case of, opposites attract. Georgina was just the complete opposite of Matthew. She was really outgoing. She basically didn't have a shy bone in her body. They also came from very different backgrounds. They were both raised in Tucson, but Matthew came from a very loving family where everyone treated everybody with love and kindness, whereas Georgina, on the other hand, was not so lucky in her early life, and she witnessed her mother unfortunately suffering abuse at the hands of her father. And as a result, when she was only 2 years old, her parents split up. Her dad actually later ended up in prison, and her mother went on to remarry, and Georgina's stepfather was a lot better to both Georgina and her mother. But unfortunately, this wasn't really the end of her troubles. During her time at school, she did quite well and pursued many different hobbies, including soccer, drama, and choir. But as she approached her senior year, things really began to unravel in her life as she started experimenting with drugs. And this was really a 0 to 100 situation because she actually ended up dropping out of school and started using drugs really heavily, and this went on for about a 4-year period until she was able to kind of see the damage she was doing. She was able to snap out of it. She just had this realization that she was going down a really bad path, and she knew that she needed help. So she went to rehab, she got clean, and when she came out of rehab, she was 24 and was looking to rebuild her life. She was doing really well at staying clean and staying out of trouble, and then Matthew came along. He was this knight in shining armor that she needed, and they fell in love very quickly. They met in 2011, and by 2013 they were married. Georgina was pregnant soon after, and the pair started making plans for their family's future. They were so excited to bring a child into the world, but it was also this moment of realization for Matthew, realization that, he had to support a family now. He had another mouth to feed, and he was going to have to make some sacrifices for that, and that is exactly what he did. He ended up accepting a job at the Morningside copper mine, which was about 3 hours north of Tucson, and so he and the family, Georgina, their unborn child, all had to make the move to Safford. They packed up their whole lives and moved there. Safford is also in Arizona. It's about 40 minutes away from his new workplace. And this whole thing was actually, a huge sacrifice for them because it may not seem far, but they had both grown up in Tucson. They had spent their whole lives in Tucson, so all of their families, their friends, their entire lives, everything was in Tucson. And although this new place was only a few hours drive, it was still they had to uproot everything, and they weren't going to be able to see people as often. It was just a massive change for them. In 2014, Georgina gave birth to their first child, a son, and he was very premature. He came a lot earlier than planned, and he had to spend a few months at the hospital, but ultimately he was okay. Georgina got pregnant quite soon after this, within a few months, and then a year after the birth of their son, she gave birth to their second child, a girl this time, and then 2 years later in 2017, she got pregnant again with their third child. But this pregnancy was very different. It was a lot more chaotic at home. Matthew and Georgina were both just really struggling. They were both exhausted. They were arguing a lot. Matthew was working these really long hours to support their growing growing family. They've got a third kid coming now. And Georgina was exhausted from also working really long hours, looking after their 2 children while also being pregnant at the same time. Like, it was all just, they were not having a good time, you know, all round. It really took a massive toll on both of them, and it ultimately led to their divorce. They filed the divorce papers, they separated after having been together for 6 years. And after filing those divorce papers is when Georgina gave birth to their 3rd child in December of 2017. All things considered, it was a pretty amicable split. They got shared custody 50-50 as appointed by the court. Georgina moved back in with her parents in Tucson, and Matthew stayed where the family had already been living and kept his job at the mines. So he was a little bit further from the children, but it was within driving distance, so it was still manageable. And he really wanted to do everything right. He wanted to do it all by the book. He wanted to remain amicable, keep everything cordial. He wanted to be flexible. He didn't want anything to blow up and become messy. Whereas Georgina, on the other hand, didn't quite feel the same. Every time Matthew would come to get the kids and spend his time with the kids, she wasn't happy about it, you know, and she would try and insert herself and intervene in his time with, you know, their children in any way that she could. She was very difficult about it. Moving forward, things really seemed like they were on the up. Matthew started dating again. He started dating his co-worker, a woman named Nicole. They both worked in the mines together, but only started dating once Matthew and Georgina had filed for divorce. You know, everyone around him just said that it was a noticeable difference when he started dating Nicole. He was much healthier. He was much happier. The relationship was healthier, and he seemed more in love with Nicole than he ever had been with Georgina. The divorce was just really seeming like it had been the best thing for everybody, because Georgina also moved on pretty quickly. She started dating someone else, but no matter how far they moved on with their lives, how much happier they were in their new relationships, Georgina just could never quite get over the custody thing. She was never content with the custody arrangement. She was always just making it difficult, looking to make it difficult for Matthew to see his children. But Matthew was just trying to keep on keeping on. He was trying to keep the peace. He was trying to move on with his life. He ended up proposing to Nicole. They got engaged in 2019 and set their wedding date for St. Patrick's Day of 2020. Everything was just going so well for them, and Matthew was so excited to have this new chance in love, but unfortunately, the wedding day would never come to be. On the morning of the 10th of February in 2020, a local fire chief was driving along Rural Highway 191, which is this massive stretch of road that covers the entire length of Arizona. As he approaches an area that the locals know as Horseshoe Curve, he notices a black Chevrolet Tahoe which had been run off the road. So he goes over to investigate, see what's going on, see if, you know, the person in the car needs help, if there's anyone in there. And when he gets to the car, he was shocked to discover that the driver was unconscious. He's hunched over towards the passenger side, and there's blood running all down the side of his face. On closer inspection, he realizes that the driver is actually dead, and there's multiple bullet holes in the side of his head. Investigators from the Clifton Police Department arrived on the scene pretty quickly, and they saw that there was shattered glass, there was bullet holes all through the side of the car. So it was obvious that these bullet holes had come from outside of the car, which made them immediately think that this may have been some sort of road rage incident. Detective Eric Ellison, who was one of the first detectives on the scene, however, said that there was just too many bullet holes in the car. Like, the sheer amount of bullet holes in this car made him believe that this wasn't just a road rage incident, this was personal. As investigators searched through the car for any clues, they found the victim's wallet, which had his Arizona driver's license in it, and through this they were able to identify him as 35-year-old Matthew Misener. A medical examiner came to the scene and determined that Matthew had been shot 3 times in the side of the head with a 9mm pistol, but they were unable to recover a single shell casing from the scene of the crime, which also went against the road rage theory, because if this was a road rage incident, then, you know, somebody is just doing it in the heat of the moment. They're shooting, they're driving away. Whereas the fact that all of the shell casings had been picked up by whoever had committed this crime seemed like it was a more planned thing. And the further they got into this investigation, the more and more they were realizing that this was definitely a planned murder. This was personal. But Matthew had no known enemies. There was nobody really they could think that disliked him. Everybody that knew him described him as a kind, caring guy. They had nothing but great things to say about him, and there was nothing to indicate that he was anything but a stand-up guy. So the investigation, of course, gets underway right away, and the detectives cordon off the area where the car was found. And it was also quite a busy stretch of road, so they're thinking that surely somebody was driving past and saw something, had some kind of information, and they're also hoping that maybe the scene of the crime will provide more clues. So as they're going through and doing a more thorough examination of the crime scene, all of a sudden Matthew's fiance Nicole shows up, and detectives immediately were suspicious that she had shown up because this was so early on in the investigation. Like, there was no media that had been informed. I don't even think Matthew's family had been informed by this point, so they were just kind of like, how did you know that Matthew was involved in this? How did you know that this incident had even happened? Why are you here? Sort of thing. But like I said, it was a very busy stretch of road. So people would have driven past, seen it. It was also a very small community, less than 5,000 people. So word got around very quickly. You know, people would have driven past and seen it and spoken about it. She's the fiance, so word would have just, you know, gotten around. But her story was that Matthew had left for work at 4 a.m. that morning, and she had left for work at 5 a.m. that morning. They obviously both worked at the same place, so they took the same route to work, and on her drive she actually saw the car off the side of the road, and she noticed that it was the same car that Matthew drove. So she pulled over to see what was going on, but she was like, you know, surely it's not Matthew. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to be late for work. So she got back in her car, she went to work. But when she got there, Matthew wasn't there, and she just had this gut feeling. She started to panic, and so she left work and she went back to that car wreck, and by the time she got back, of course, you know, all of the police were there and the area had been barricaded off. Up until this point, of course, she didn't know what the deal was. She didn't know what the situation was. She didn't know if the car belonged to Matthew, who was involved, if it was a wreck, if anyone was injured or not. So at this point, detectives actually had to deliver the heartbreaking news to her that that was in fact her fiance in that car wreck and that he was dead. And not only was he dead, but he had been shot 3 times by somebody, which of course was so confusing and confronting and overwhelming for Nicole. She just broke down in tears. She could not believe that the man that she loved, who she planned to marry in less than 2 months, was there dead. And she could not believe it. And while she's processing all of these emotions as well, of course she still has to be ruled out as a suspect. So police have to take photos of her car, they have to take her fingerprints, her DNA, they have to test her for gunshot residue, they also have to question her. They asked her about Matthew and his life, and she gave a lot of information, so I'm going to go over all of that now. So she told detectives that Matthew was a well-liked guy. He got along with everybody at their work. She also went into detail about Matthew's relationship with his ex-wife, Georgina, because obviously, as you already know, there was some custody battles going on, and Georgina was just having issues with the custody arrangement. And things got really bad about 6 months before Matthew's death, when Georgina informed him that she had cancer. She told him that she had already tried to do chemo, but it didn't work. It pretty much almost killed her, and that other treatment options were futile. And Matthew was, of course, extremely sympathetic. He wanted to do whatever he could to try and take some stress off her. He wanted to take on some of, you know, her responsibilities and help her out in whatever way that he could. But surprisingly, he was met with a lot of resistance, especially when it came to, of course, the children and looking after the children. He was denied visitation rights, and of course, this was the real root of their problems with each other. Matthew's fiance Nicole actually ended up becoming fed up with the entire situation and decided to intervene herself. So she went with Matthew to Georgina's house and told Georgina, like, look, this is not fair. And it just really set Georgina off, and she ended up slapping Nicole in the face. So things were just getting really messy, really heated. Georgina was getting aggressive, and she actually ended up going as far as to file a CPS report against Matthew and Nicole for abuse, which is rich considering she's the one that slapped Nicole. I think maybe she was just trying to get ahead of it all before Nicole and Matthew could make a report against her for obviously slapping Nicole. CPS came, they did an investigation, and they thought, you know, they decided ultimately that the claims were false. There was no abuse from Matthew and Nicole. And then on the 5th of February 2020, so just 5 days before Matthew was murdered, he actually filed for full custody of the children. He was worried about Georgina's mental health, worried that, she wasn't quite stable to be looking after the children. And the custody hearing was set for, get this, the 11th of February 2020, so the day after Matthew was murdered. Of course, as soon as detectives find out all of this information, Georgina shoots right to the top of their suspect list. Now, at around the same time they got all of this information, the Safford Police Department also received a call from a witness who had heard about the wreck and everything that was going on and wanted to provide a tip because they said that they were in the area. The caller basically claimed that they had driven past the scene right after Matthew was killed, and they didn't really know what they were looking at the time. They just saw a car off the side of the road, thought maybe they had blown a tire or something, didn't really think much of it, as you generally wouldn't if you just saw a car pulled off the side of the road. But what he did see was a white sedan make a U-turn at the scene and then accelerate off in the opposite direction like they were fleeing. Police also received a call from another witness who said that they had been driving behind Matthew's car that morning on Matthew's way to work, and Matthew was driving slightly faster than this guy, so he lost him for a bit, and when he didn't have him in his vision, he heard a pop, which at the time he didn't think much of, but in hindsight he thinks may have been the sound of a gunshot. Eventually he catches up to Matthew's car, which is now off the side of the road, and as he passes him, he sees that there's a white sedan parked in front of Matthew's car. This sedan does a U-turn and accelerates off, fleeing in the opposite direction from the crime scene. So that's now 2 witnesses that have seen a white sedan fleeing from the scene of the crime. So of course police are now on the hunt for this white sedan. They go and talk to Nicole again, see if she or Matthew knew anyone with a white sedan. And Nicole says, you know what, actually 5 days earlier, that Matthew had gone to pick up his kids or see his kids or whatever. He's at Georgina's house and a man pulls up at the house as well and starts taking photos of Matthew and his car and his license plate. And Matthew was on the phone to Nicole as this was happening, and Nicole was like, that's really weird, you should take a photo of his car and his number plate. So he does exactly that. He sends it to Nicole. Nicole, as she's talking to detectives, is going through her phone to find this photo. She finds it, and the car is a white sedan. Detectives run the number plates from the photo that Nicole provided them with, and they find that this car belongs to 2 men, a guy named Eduardo Montano Jr. and then his grandfather, Samuel Sandoval. So it was Eduardo's car, but it was registered in his grandfather's name. Eduardo Montano Jr. also had 2 misdemeanor warrants out against him, and so the sheriff called the Pima County Police, who were closer to where Eduardo lived, and they had him arrested, and within a few hours of the white car tip-off, Eduardo had been placed under arrest for his 2 outstanding warrants, and when they went to arrest him at his house, in his driveway was a white Cadillac sedan which matched the witness reports. So while detectives waited for search warrants for Eduardo's house and car, they took him into the Pima County Sheriff's Office for questioning. They asked him what he had been doing the night before and that morning, and Eduardo said that he had gone to a couple of friends' houses, after which he had returned to his grandfather's house, which is where he lived, and he claimed that he had been nowhere near the scene of the crime. Detectives asked him why he was at Georgina's house on the 5th of February and what his relationship was with Georgina, and he said they were just friends, that they had tried to date but it didn't work out. They asked if he knew Matthew, and he was pretty upfront with them and said that he did know of Matthew through Georgina, that he was aware of the custody battle that they were having, but that he had never spoken to Matthew himself. Detectives in response said, well, we know that you were taking photos of his car, why were you doing that? And his response was just, I've never spoken to Matthew. Detectives, of course, press him a little bit more. They start acting like they know a little bit more than they really do. And at that point, Eduardo just randomly is like, my grandfather told me about this accident this morning. As in, his grandfather had told him about that car accident, thinking that Eduardo might be involved, which I don't even know how his grandfather would know about the incident, why he would bring it up with Eduardo randomly, but it was just weird timing that he brought that up when he randomly started getting pressed on his whereabouts of that morning, you know what I mean? Eduardo was still very adamant that he was nowhere near the crash that morning, the night before, at any point. You know, he was with his friends and then he went home and that was it. And so there was nothing really more detectives could do at that time. So obviously they're still trying to get more information on this Eduardo guy because his car was involved. His car was seen at the scene of the crime, and then, you know, he has this connection with Georgina. Like, he's just, you know, so intertwined. They're like, this guy has something to do with this. We need to figure out what. And so that's what they're doing now. They're trying to get more information on him because they can't get anything from Eduardo himself. They go and speak to Georgina at her mother's house, and detectives that spoke to her noted that her emotions appeared to be all over the place. She was happy, and then she was crying, and then she was mad, and then they also noted that her demeanor appeared very rehearsed. They quizzed her on her relationship with Matthew, and she explained that she didn't want Matthew to have the children because she didn't like Matthew's fiancée, Nicole. She told detectives that Matthew and Nicole were abusive, and that's why she didn't want them to have the kids, which, you know, this excuse just fell short for detectives because it wasn't true. CPS had looked into it. There was no signs, no evidence whatsoever of any sort of abuse from Matthew or Nicole. Detectives asked Georgina about her relationship with Eduardo. She said they were friends, they had tried to date for about a month, but it didn't work out, and that she had also confided in him about the alleged abuse, about the custody battle, and she felt comfortable sharing this information with him because he had also experienced abuse in his life, and he also helped her out with the kids. He was very protective of the family. So obviously, you know how this is looking to police. You know, he's still pursuing Georgina, he's very protective of her and the kids, and now he thinks that Matthew is abusing these people that he loves and he cares for, so he can just go out, solve the custody battle, get rid of the ex-husband all in one. And they didn't believe that he was alone in this. They believed that, you know, after getting all of this information, that Georgina and Eduardo had kind of planned this whole thing together. Of course, Eduardo had an alibi, so they wanted to go and check out his alibi. They went to his grandfather's house, questioned his grandfather Samuel. They said, hey, was Eduardo here last night? And his grandfather says, no, he left at 10 p.m. last night, and then he didn't come home till about 8 or 8:30 a.m. in the morning, which lines up perfectly with the murder because, of course, the murder happened at around 5 a.m., which would give him more than enough time to commit this murder and get back to Tucson by 8 a.m. For investigators, this was pretty much the nail in the coffin. They were like, yep, this is our guy. There's no way it's not him. They had a bunch of circumstantial evidence against him by this point. The only thing they didn't have was physical evidence. That's what they needed. They needed some sort of physical evidence so they could actually arrest him and convict him of the crime. When their search warrants came through, they went and did a thorough sweep of the house that Eduardo and Samuel shared. In Eduardo's bedroom, they found a 9mm Ruger pistol, which of course lines up with the medical examiner's findings that Matthew was shot with a 9mm pistol. There were 4 rounds left in the magazine found in Eduardo's bedroom, which aligned perfectly with how many bullets had been shot at Matthew, because investigators found that about 14 bullets had been shot at Matthew. So they sent the gun off for forensic testing, and they also executed an arrest warrant to arrest Eduardo and bring him in for more questioning. He was arrested on the 13th of February and brought back to Greenlee County, where he was held on a $1 million bond. And just to remind you, Matthew was murdered on the 10th. So within 72 hours, detectives already have a suspect arrested in custody. It's all moving very quickly. But they still have to be able to prove a motive, and they also don't think that that's the end of the case. They think there's more that they have left to unpack. They believe that Matthew's ex-wife Georgina is involved, that she and Eduardo were in this together, and so they still need to go and look for more information against her and figure out what her involvement is. So they go and question Georgina again, more aggressively this time, and she is just super unhelpful, to be honest. Like, she cannot even give a ballpark of when she last saw Eduardo. She can't say if it was last week, last month, last year. She cannot, for the life of her, remember what the last time she saw Eduardo was, which is very convenient for her. They directly ask her if she was involved in Matthew's murder, and she, like all innocent people do, immediately stopped the interview and said, I don't want to talk anymore. They seized her phone for digital analysis, but she was still free to go. While they're waiting for her phone to be analysed, they go and question people who were close to the estranged couple, Georgina and Matthew, and this is when they find out some very juicy new information. They find out that Georgina was actually lying about having cancer, which is crazy how many people people actually do that? Like, it boggles my mind. It's happened in many Mystery Monday cases I've done. I even knew someone in high school that faked having cancer, and it, like, my brain cannot even fathom. I cannot imagine just like being like, yeah, let me fake having cancer real quick. Why is that? Like, why does that happen so often? Anyway, detectives found out that one of the photos that Georgina sent to Matthew being like, hey, look how sick I am, was actually just a photo she had found online. It turns out the cancer thing was just a whole nother ploy to try and prevent Matthew from being able to see the kids. She had even been trying to turn Matthew's friends and his family against him, trying to paint him out to be this bad, inconsiderate person, when really it just backfired on her in the end and made her look like she was very manipulative, and it just strengthened the theory that she was kind of the mastermind behind the murder, that she manipulated Eduardo into murdering her ex-husband so that she could fully have her kids to herself. Of course, there's still no physical evidence at this point, but then a breakthrough on the 25th of February, they get all of the phone analysis back from her phone, and there are some very, very incriminating texts on her phone. These texts were between her and Eduardo, and they also placed Eduardo in the location of Matthew's house. So it seemed like Eduardo had actually been stalking Matthew as well before the murders. And it also seemed like Georgina had tried to delete these texts from her phone. But if you've been here a while, if you've been watching these Mystery Mondays, you've been here with me, then you would know that you can't actually delete things from your phone. You cannot just erase something from your phone or from the internet that the police are not going to be able to recover. On the 7th of February, so 3 days before Matthew's murder, Eduardo sent Georgina a text that said, been outside Matt's all night and haven't seen him. In another text message, Eduardo asked her for Matt's fiance Nicole's address, and Georgina replies with the address and also tells him what car Nicole drives. The text messages between them also show that they were a lot closer than what they told detectives. You know, their story is, we tried to date for about a month, it didn't work out, so we're just friends. But in many of their texts, they are telling each other, you know, I love you and blah, 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 after the period of time in which they claimed to have stopped dating, claimed that they weren't really that close anymore, they were just friends, whatever. Then on the 9th of February, so the day before Matthew's murder, this is where the texts get really bad, really incriminating. Georgina sends Eduardo a text that says something along the lines of, I've got my custody battle coming up, because obviously her custody battle was on the 11th of February, the day after Matthew's murder. She says, I've got my custody battle coming up, it better be done. Eduardo responds and he says, I don't think I can do this, to which Georgina then responds and says, if you want to marry me, you need to show me what kind of man you are. And I don't even think that's the worst of it. I think this next one is the worst one. So Eduardo texts Georgina and says, do you want me to notify you once it's done? Georgina then responds to that and says, when I find out from whomever I find out from, I think that's better for a reaction than if you tell me when it's done. So basically, like, don't tell me once you've murdered him. Someone can tell me, and then I can like really dredge up those emotions hearing it for the first time. Just 10 hours after these text messages were exchanged, Matthew's body was discovered. So of course, after all of these texts were found, on the 26th of February 2020, Georgina was arrested for Matthew's murder. Before she could even be taken away, she was on the phone with her lawyer who was instructing her not to say anything. Meanwhile, the results of the forensic analysis of the gun that was found in Eduardo's room came back, and it was confirmed that this gun was in fact the murder weapon. The prosecution's theory here was that basically Eduardo in the early hours of the morning went to the area known as Horseshoe Curve, and he sat there and he waited for Matthew to pass him, obviously knowing Matthew's route that he drove to work. He sat there, he waited for Matthew to drive past him. When he sees Matthew drive past him, he pulls up next to Matthew's car and starts shooting at him, which kills Matthew and causes Matthew's car to drive off the side of the road. Eduardo's case actually never made it to trial because I guess he looked at all of the evidence they had against him and was like, you know, there's no getting out of this one. So he accepted a plea deal, and at 36 years old, he pled guilty to second-degree murder and aggravated assault and was sentenced to 33 years and 9 months in prison. Not once did he ever implicate Georgina in the crime. He tried to take all of the blame and all of the responsibility himself, but by accepting his plea deal, he essentially admitted to conspiring with her to commit the crime, because without Georgina, there really wouldn't have been a murder or a reason, you know, to murder Matthew. Then in November of 2020, Georgina also accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit aggravated assault. She had her sentencing hearing on the 5th of January in 2021, and at this hearing, her attorney spoke of her mental health issues and her difficult childhood, noting that her mental instability should be considered. Georgina also took the stand and begged for mercy from the judge, and she put on all the waterworks and everything. It was hard to make out what she was saying at times actually because of it. And although she apologized for what she did, she was really trying to still paint herself as the victim. She said that she wasn't aware that Eduardo was planning to kill Matthew. Like, come on, girl. The prosecution just pulled up the text messages. They were like, come on. Be realistic here. Like, you basically almost outright said in these text messages, if you want to marry me, you better go kill my ex-husband. Not to mention, this whole thing just really didn't look good for her, because this time where she took the stand was really her time to show remorse. It was her time to apologize for everything that she had done to Matthew, to his fiance, everything that he had put their children through, his family through, and instead she's just trying to play the victim and get sympathy herself. She couldn't, not even once, just take a little bit of accountability. Matthew's family also thought that she was unremorseful. They took to the stand themselves to say that, she never really cared about the kids. She just cared about herself, and that was it. It was all about what she wanted. Matthew's father, Ray, took to the stand and said, quote, "What he was to us is impossible to describe. Now he's gone and I'll never be able to hug him again." Eduardo also sent in a letter for the hearing, and he basically, again, tried to take all accountability, say that Georgina was not involved in any way, but in the end, she was sentenced to 33 years and 9 months in prison. And that's pretty much everything for this case. So I really want to know your thoughts on this one, because truly, I cannot even believe that this sort of thing happens in the world, and it's so tragic for Matthew's friends, his family, his fiance, but those children, their 3 children, not only have they lost their father, but they've lost their mother too. She was responsible, their own mother was responsible for their father's death, and Matthew really seemed like, from all accounts, such a great guy. I can't even imagine, I cannot even begin to fathom how that would affect and traumatize you growing up, having that sort of thing happen to you at such a young age too. But yeah, that's everything for this case. That's all from me today, guys. I really look forward to chatting with you in the comments about this one, because it truly is such an insane case to wrap your head around. But yeah, that's all. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week, and hopefully I'll see you in my next one. Bye, guys.